Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Also consider joining my Patreon page for some cool perks. I'll leave a link in the description. I know what you need, some more rock and read. Today we'll read chapter 19 of My Life in the Eagles by Don Felder. We only have 2 chapters left in this book, so I'm going to read chapter 19 this week and chapter 20 next week. Then we'll be done and we can move on to something else. Chapter 19 is called You're Fired. Here we go. My marriage had by now become a serious cause for concern. There was this huge void in my life which I didn't know how to fill. Susan and I had been together on and off since I was with Bernie in the Monty Quintet. I had run the gauntlet of snakes, alligators, drugs, and women just to be with her. We'd had 4 wonderful children together, and I held her hand through every birth. Now, I don't think I even knew who she was, this high-powered business executive who had no time to even share a meal with me. My frustration was epitomized by an evening in the summer of 1999, when I managed to track her down on her cell phone after fruitlessly leaving her messages all day. "Hey honey," I said, "let's go see a movie and have dinner tonight out at the new Palace Theater in Calabasas. If we get there early enough, we can be home in time for Leah when she comes back from her friend's house, and I'll bring her some takeout from the restaurant." "Oh, I don't know, Dawn," Susan began. "I was actually planning to work late tonight." "Come on, honey," I pleaded. "I haven't seen you all week." She relented. "Okay, I'll meet you there." The movie started at 4:30 and I arrived at 4 o'clock, bought 2 tickets, and waited around for her, but she was over 40 minutes late. When she eventually arrived, she sat down with me a third of the way through the film and ate her way through half a bucket of popcorn because she had skipped lunch. When the film was over, I said excitedly, "Okay, what do you feel like eating? Italian? Chinese?" "Oh, Dawn," she said, wrinkling her nose, "I'm not really hungry. Do you mind if we skip dinner? I think I'd rather go to the bookstore and browse for a while." With that, she wandered off to Barnes & Noble and left me standing in the mall, staggered by her attitude. Not only had she almost stood me up, but she had blown off our romantic evening completely. I walked into the bookstore and told her I was going to order some fettuccine for Leah from the Italian restaurant. She still had her nose buried in a jewelry book when I returned. "You know, I don't want this to get cold," I told her. "I think I'll just go home." "Okay," she said without even looking up. When I got home, I was too upset to eat. I left Leah's meal in the oven and went straight to my office to surf the web, unhappier than I had been in many years. I heard Susan come home an hour later and go to her studio without even saying hello. I knew she'd eventually come to bed in the early hours, roll over, and go to sleep. One evening together couldn't have been more sterile and coldly unromantic. There was never a screaming match where we told each other, "I hate your guts." That might have been preferable. This was like a slow, silent death, and I knew that night that my marriage was all but over. In 1999, talks began again about us getting together to possibly record some new material. At the end of the year, we were booked to perform 3 End of the Millennium shows, 2 to be held at the gilded Mandalay Bay Event Center in Las Vegas on December 27th and 28th, and 1 at the Staples Center in LA on December 31st. It was hoped that we might come up with some new songs, but it was not to be. Glenn sent us all a fax setting out his terms and conditions for any possible resumption. He blamed stress and cited the unique dynamics of the band as a contributory factor. "Unfortunately," he wrote, "the Eagles' experience is a stressful one for me. Although it's what I call positive stress, it is stress nonetheless. So the big questions for me are, how do I handle my commitment to the December shows and also continue to make some sort of effort to work on a studio album with you guys? I've given this a lot of thought. At this time, here's what I'm willing to do." He then set out 5 conditions for his returning to work, which included preparing 5 Glenn songs for the album, along with any songs he might co-author, and agreeing to work on Joe's material. The lines were being drawn. To me, it seemed the problem was that we hadn't played a concert together publicly for more than 3 years, and hadn't socialized much either. The last time we had seen each other had been the Hall of Fame Awards, and that hadn't been the best of atmospheres. Irving's new plan was to piece together the best of the Millennium concerts, featuring a few never-before-recorded but nonetheless old songs, for a box set to be released in 2000. That way we'd be getting a new product out to the public, thus keeping us in the open market until we could finally get it together to release a new studio album. He had also done a deal to offer the previously unreleased songs to download for free on the internet, setting a new precedent in music marketing, although the songs were later withdrawn due to unforeseen publishing licensing problems. I had more serious problems to worry about. I decided that once the concerts were over and the new year had arrived, I'd be telling Susan that I was leaving her. It's a terrible feeling, knowing you're about to do something irrevocable and heartbreaking to your wife and kids, but being unable to prevent it. Marriage counseling wasn't an option. We'd been in therapy for years, and I knew that neither Susan nor I could or would change. It wasn't that I didn't love her anymore. I always would, but her jewelry business was her life now, a life I had helped her create, as an antidote to being the wife of an absentee rock star. I knew that I only had myself to blame for all the pain and suffering I had caused, and that I was about to cause more, but I also knew that I couldn't remain in that marriage a moment longer. The kids were grown. Jesse was married with a son of his own and another child on the way. Rebecca was caught up in Susan's business, Cody was finally finding his footing, and Leah was so busy with her hectic teenage social life that she barely seemed to notice my existence. I felt confident that after the initial shock, they'd come to see that I was right. Whenever I asked them, none of them could even remember the last time they saw Susan and me cuddle or kiss. Was I to stay in that lonely, sterile environment forever just for the sake of propriety? I faced the Millennium concert rehearsals just after Thanksgiving with a heavy heart. They would in some ways be a welcome distraction. When I arrived at Culver Studios, I quickly gathered that there was much that had to be redone and relearned. Hours were spent in discussion with the lighting designer and the monitor crew, and for some time we were unable to concentrate on the music at all. For us old-time rockers, the move into the 21st century with its high-tech wizardry was not always easy. As well as worrying about the technical side of the gigs, we were running back and forth between the studio and the rehearsal hall near Pico and Sepulveda. When we did try to make music, none of us seemed to be playing very well, and there was even more friction than usual between Don and Glenn, who had completely abandoned any ideas of writing together. Part of the problem was, I think, that they simply ran out of words. With more than 50 Eagles songs under their belts between them, not to mention their individual solo efforts, their vocabulary, like their patience, was running thin. Their broad-sweeping panorama had always been Los Angeles, and there were only so many ways you could describe the people and the desert and the paradoxes of this extraordinary city before drying up. On December 7, 1999, a couple weeks before the gigs, Irving set up a press conference in the rehearsal hall so that we could receive official plaques commemorating record sales for Greatest Hits 1971 through 1975, the album the record company had released almost as a stalling tactic while we finished Hotel California. You'll just have to stop rehearsing for a few minutes, come out, say hello, play a song, and then you can get right back to work, he told us confidently. We were right up against the wire time-wise and could have done without the interruption, but we did as we were told and conducted a quick sound check before the press conference. The five of us wandered out into the rehearsal hall with cups of coffee and our instruments and sat on 5 stools in a row, playing a few verses of Tequila Sunrise to a half-empty room while some stagehands set up chairs in readiness. A few hours later, when we walked back out onto the stage, we were faced with a barrage of flash bulbs and a flurry of activity. There were many television cameras, about 40 still photographers, and maybe 50 international press reporters, their notepads in hand. The number of chairs put out was woefully inadequate. There was a live broadcast on CNN's Showbiz Today with Jim Morit, and we were also live on the web. It was the largest press conference we had ever faced. I think we all realized then how important this award was. It wasn't just Irving blowing smoke up our ass. Hillary Rosen, chairman and chief executive of the Recording Industry Association of America, had flown in from Washington to present us with the plaque and to declare Greatest Hits the biggest selling album of the 20th century, with 26 million units sold. It even outsold Michael Jackson's Thriller, which was close behind us and which many considered to be the album of the epoch. Don told the assembled media that, as he couldn't remember much about the 70s, it was nice to have the plaque to remind him what he'd been up to. He added, "I think the real award is that we're all alive and well when so many of our colleagues aren't." We all echoed that. In answer to a question about the effect the Eagles had on people's lives, Glenn replied, "The music you play is the soundtrack of your life. It's your life movie. In the 70s, people did things to the Eagles. They broke up with their girlfriend, they broke up with their boyfriend, they got in a car and drove across America, they went on a fandango. We seemed to be the soundtrack. People liked having our music in the background of their movie." I told the reporters, "This is beyond my wildest imagination. It's an amazing award and one none of us really expected. It's a testament to the songwriting of these two guys right here. Those songs stood the test of time." Asked about ongoing friction between band members, Glenn replied with 100% honesty, "We're putting up a front for you, you know. We're on TV." When the laughter died away, he added, "I think any worthwhile relationship has its peaks and valleys. This band's had some valleys, but we're probably in pretty good shape right now." Of the Millennium gigs, he added, "I think the nostalgia and the feelings that are associated with a band like the Eagles are going to be amplified to a degree that we've never experienced. To stand in Southern California on New Year's Eve and play all those songs, which are so much about California, so many of them written in California where we lived, I think I'm looking forward to a pretty emotional evening myself. I'm going to cry." Hillary Rosen assured me privately that Bernie and Randy would each be given a copy of the plaque. In my opinion, they should have been there to receive it in person. They were as much responsible for that album as Don, Glenn, or me, and certainly more than Joe or Tim, who were not even on any of the tracks of this album, but the gods would never have allowed it. When we received our award and posed for photographs, we picked up our guitars and sat on the stools we had practiced on earlier and played Tequila Sunrise. As always, it was a brilliantly convincing performance of unity. I have to say, that award really blew me away. Don described it very aptly as musical Viagra. I had been completely oblivious to how well that album had actually done. I knew it had sold consistently over the years, but didn't realize exactly how well until that moment. Never in my wildest childhood dreams did I expect to surpass my idols Elvis Presley, Bill Haley and his Comets, or B.B. King in record sales. I thought of the time I had jammed down in Colortown or stood in that barn watching B.B. play, and I had to pinch myself to believe what we had achieved. It seemed amazing to me at the age of 52 that I could have made my living doing what I had always wanted to do, ever since I swapped my cherry bombs for my first guitar. My marriage had all but survived the rigors of years on the road, even if it was in its death throes now, and I had 4 fantastic kids, a grandson, and a beautiful home. Whichever way I looked at it, I was rich beyond the dreams of Gainesville and would never have to work again. I think even my father might have been proud. The Millennium concert, dubbed by fans the Eagle-Lennium, went ahead, despite a serious dose of the flu that left me barely able to stand. It began a few days before the first show and lasted all the way into January. I was so sick. I had a high fever, was clogged with mucus, and couldn't speak without coughing up fluid from my lungs. There was never any suggestion of canceling. We had a multi-million-dollar performance bond, and New Year's Eve 1999 was not a gig you could cancel and just reschedule. I knew I had to go on, no matter what. Jackson Browne opened for us with his usual professional set, featuring his classics such as Doctor, My Eyes, The Pretender, and Running on Empty. My old rival David Windley played with him, and David Crosby joined him on stage for the song For Every Man. Then it was our turn. Standing in front of the top half of a giant clock face with Roman numerals, beneath huge stained glass chandeliers, flanked by a scarlet curtain, we opened with Hotel California. The fired-up audience of 12,000 of our most dedicated fans was well programmed to receive, and then continued with the usual playlist: Victim of Love, New Kid in Town, and Wasted Time. I could hardly stay upright on stage and couldn't see beyond the lights because of my flu delirium. The music we were playing seemed to roar like the sea in my ears. I had 4 different doctors give me different prescriptions. I was dosed up to my eyeballs with injections and pills. Susan and the kids were there to give me support as I lay down on the floor of my dressing room shivering between sets. Thankfully, there was a 20-minute intermission during which a film co-produced by Glenn was shown on giant video screens. It was a montage of music and images of the century, run with the score Glenn wrote with songwriter Jay Oliver, and a series of spoof interviews, with each of us claiming the credit for naming the band and writing Hotel California, in a misjudged attempt to make us look like humorous best buddies. After the intermission, I staggered back out onto the stage. I tried to keep my voice from breaking during a rendition of Seven Bridges Road, and then I tried to rock. I was having a really hard time under the hot lights and never received a flicker of sympathy from the gods. In my view, our performances on those 3 nights weren't great, especially bearing in mind how much people had paid to hear us play. Glenn sang Randy's Take It to the Limit, but without his uniquely soulful voice, it simply didn't work. Thankfully, the crowd sang along to almost every song, bolstering us through our weakest moments. Our only really good number was a new rhythm and blues version of The Best of My Love, which sizzled. For that song, we were on fire. To appease those who wanted to hear new or different material, we included some seldom heard numbers like Tom Waits, Old 55, Those Shoes, and Please Come Home for Christmas, saving Funky New Year for the fireworks spitting encore, snippets of which were broadcast live on CNN shortly after midnight on New Year's as the chosen celebration for the West Coast of America. Bang in the middle of Funky New Year, Don for some reason sang a Millennium rap, trying to sound like some New York rap artist and failing badly. We got back together, we broke up, he said, clicking his fingers in time. We got back together, we broke up, we got back together. Nobody, least of all us, found it terribly amusing, except him. As the clock struck midnight, I slumped over my guitar with relief. The ordeal was over. I searched for Susan at the side of the stage to give her a kiss, but she was nowhere to be found. Back home after New Year's Eve, I gradually recovered from the flu and gained my physical and mental strength for what I knew was to come. Susan and I were communicating largely through notes left on the kitchen work surface. I felt starved of affection and horribly lonely in my own home. Finally, one day in late January, I took off to Palm Springs to escape what had become an untenable situation. I tried to reach her during the day, but eventually left her a note which said, "Gone to the Palm Springs Film Festival and to play golf." When she called me at my hotel later that night and asked why I had just taken off, I blurted out all that I was feeling about my marriage. "It's over, Susan," I told her, the words sticking in my throat. "I know this probably isn't the kindest way to tell you, but I'm afraid that's the truth. We're not in love anymore. I'm so sorry." I know I didn't handle it very well and that I should have had the courage to break it to her personally, but I was just so tired of waiting for her to find a window in her busy schedule so I could tell her we were through. I honestly thought she would have seen this coming, but her response was far from expected. She was absolutely devastated and refused to communicate with me, dealing only with our family therapist. In an atmosphere of bitter recrimination, I moved out onto my boat, and within a week I was served with divorce papers. The kids were shattered. One by one they came to me by the boat, and we held each other and cried together. "I will always love your mother. I just can't live with her anymore," I told them. If I could have taken away any of the hurt, I would have. But it was too late. The sense of cold isolation I felt left me unable to sleep or eat. I felt as if a piece of my heart had been cut out. Thus began a long, sustained period of darkness that crept over every aspect of my life and plunged me to new depths of despair. Never once did Glenn or Don call me up and offer any support or sympathy over the breakdown of my 29-year marriage. Not once did they phone to ask, "Hey man, are you okay?" Glenn had been divorced. He knew what it was like. Joe, Timothy, even Irving called up. Many other people, including some I least expected, offered their support. When you're going through such a time, you come to realize that the ones who step up are your real friends. The rest no longer count. Work became a welcome distraction. "Let's go into the studio and finish the record from the Millennium gig," Irving told us. "But we don't even have a record deal yet," I pointed out. "Don't worry," he assured me, that smile of his ever more unnerving. "The negotiations are well underway. Just go in and do this on a good faith basis and we'll fine-tune the details later." The venue was preset. Glenn's Doghouse and Elliot Snyder as the producer, no questions asked. The recording needed a great deal of post-production work, all of which was done with each member separately, and Glenn as an invisible producer. so that he never actually had to work directly with any of the other band members. He had spent the 5 months since the gigs deciding which recording of which song to choose from which night. Once he had made his selection and completed his own vocal and guitar parts, he set dates for each of us to go in separately and fix our own parts. Don Henley, Elias' grandpa, was scheduled to come in last after everyone else had finished because every hair on his entire body would have stood straight on end if he had heard the first takes. Trouble was, we weren't even at the record plant or Criteria. Glenn was at his home in Hawaii playing golf or doing some corporate show for big bucks, a lucrative new sideline of his. Don was on tour or busy in Dallas or promoting his new pet project, the Recording Artists Coalition, professing equality for musicians in the business, campaigning to change what he called the unfair practices of record companies. Nobody seemed to be talking to anyone else. Joe and Tim were scheduled to come in at separate times from me. Nothing I said seemed to matter. I felt our sound had become glossy, corporate, less human, and in my opinion, downright lousy, if you want to know the truth. Then again, the album's later sales showed that millions of people disagreed, so what did I know? They just don't know what they're missing. Despite Irving's repeated warnings not to make waves, I never stopped asking to see the various documents that would allow me and my attorneys to assess the deals that Don, Glenn, and Irving were making, especially this new one, which could potentially be our most important. Because of my continued interest in the current negotiations, many of the feelings that had been harbored against me in the 70s and 80s resurfaced. I was made to feel isolated and out of the loop once more. For whatever reason, the triumvirate didn't like me asking too many questions. Maybe because of my newfound courage from having just dealt with the unhappiness of my marriage, I didn't take Irving's warnings too seriously. Susan and I had a long way to go before we'd be talking again. But the fact that I had faced up to the demise of my marriage and come out the other side lulled me into a false sense of security as to how much I could push a situation. Incident after incident with Don, Glenn, and Irving made me realize that the time was coming when I would have to stand up to the gods as well, and say or do something to stop them from treating the rest of us like lowly subordinates. A classic example was that of Timothy, Drury, and John Corey. Timothy was a multi-talented musician who toured with us for years, and who had played on Don's solo tours before that. John, who played keyboards, was much the same and had co-written some of Don's solo songs. Timothy had written a short classical segue, a beautiful piece of music that he had played on piano during the intermission of each show every night during the Hell Freezes Over tour. Don played the string part so it sounded like an orchestral introduction. When that music started, we knew on cue that half of us would walk out from stage left and half from stage right. Our gate in perfect time to the music and set up 5 stools placed at the front of the stage. Just as we had all sat down, the music would end and Glenn would say, "Hi, and welcome back to the second half of our show," and we'd launch into an acoustic version of Tequila Sunrise. It worked like a dream. When it came to putting together the music for the box set, I heard that Don, Glenn, and Irving decided that they wanted to use that little piece of music that Timothy had written and played live. He was delighted, thinking he'd have a tiny slice of the lucrative writers' and publishers' royalties on an Eagle record. But that wasn't the deal. Irving told him that he just wanted to do a buyout and offered Timothy a couple $1,000. Timothy was horrified, but it told me it was a take-it-or-leave-it deal. Timothy couldn't believe it. He'd let the Eagles use that piece of music over and over for 6 years. He'd been pounding around on the road with us for all these years. The music was not included. Fred Wilecki, our old friend from Westwood Music, developed throat cancer that year and had to have his voice box removed. Days after his surgery, which cost 6 figures and wasn't fully covered by his medical insurance, Bernie Leadon contacted Jackson Browne, Linda Ronstadt, and Glenn Johns, the English producer who had put the first Eagles albums together and shared Bernie's country rock vision, and the 4 of them decided to organize a benefit gig. Word hit the streets, and a veteran lineup of California's finest musicians agreed to play the gig that August. Among them were Don Henley, Randy Meisner, Graham Nash, David Wenley, David Crosby, Linda Ronstadt, Chris Hillman, and Ry Cooder. Over 2 nights at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium, the friends of Fred Wilecki stepped up and played, as Fred sat with his new electronic voice box in a seat of honor at the front of the stage. Randy, Bernie, and Don all played separately. Randy brought his own band and sang Take It to the Limit and Already Gone. Don sang Desperado and a couple of his solo hits. Bernie stayed on stage most of the night as a backup musician, but they never all played together. Randy's wife, who wanted a photograph of her husband with Don Henley, approached him with her camera and asked him if he'd mind posing. Without saying a word, Don turned on his heel and walked away. I was very hurt not to have been invited along. I knew Fred well and would have gladly volunteered my services. I knew most of the people on that stage intimately, and yet no one had thought to pick up the phone. I began to wonder how much my ongoing negotiations with Irving and the gods were affecting every aspect of my life, including my associations with such good friends in the business. Later that year, I finally moved off the boat and started looking around for some place of my own to live. I decided to rent a house in LA to begin with until I could find what I wanted to buy. The divorce negotiations were proceeding at a snail's pace now that Susan's lawyers were involved, even though I told her from the start that I was happy for her to have half of everything that I owned. I didn't yet know exactly how much I'd be left with or even if I wanted to stay in LA. There were times when I wondered where my life was leading. I was homeless, divorcing, and without any sense of self-worth. I hated myself for what I'd done to my family. I resented Irving and the gods for what they were doing to me, and I longed for a return to the happier days of my youth, when the Eagles were just starting out and Susan and I were different people. We're on the brink of something here, I said in the Miyako Hotel in San Francisco the night she had first told me she was pregnant. Like, this could really be the beginning, you know? 29 years on, and it felt like everything was ending. The brink I'd faced now was far less appealing. During the extremely dispiriting process of being newly single after almost 3 decades of marriage, while searching for a small rental house of my own, something extraordinarily and totally unexpected happened. I met Catherine Nicholson, who made me feel as if I had tripped and fallen into heaven. From the moment I set eyes on her, it was like I had been reunited with someone I had been madly in love with for hundreds of years. Catherine was beautiful, and although almost 20 years younger than me, had a wise head on her shoulders. She was like a bright light illuminating the darkest period of my life, a lighthouse on a stormy coast, as steadfast as could be, showing me the way. Believe me, I have clung to that light beam ever since. After months of trying to find out the details of the deal from Irving, I was finally told. A new company called NEA had been set up to handle the box set, with Don and Glenn as its sole owners. I was never told what NEA stood for. I assumed it was New Eagles Agreement, although it might as well have been Never Expect Anything. Elektra, with distribution through Giant Records, Irving's company, was releasing the box set, called Selected Works 1972 through 1999, in November 2000, in time for the Christmas market. Music from the Millennium gigs would feature on the last of 4 discs. When I called Irving and dared to suggest that what he was suggesting might not be fair, the man who had once said he had more money than God was unequivocal. "If you don't sign that deal," he screamed to me over the telephone with that terrifying booming voice of his, "you'll never set foot on stage with these guys again." And I was paying him commissions? Furious, I screwed all my courage up into a ball and yelled back, "Don't talk to me like that, Irving," I shouted. "Do you ever call up Don and Glenn and scream at them over the phone? If you want to talk to me reasonably about this, then call me back when you've calmed down. But don't scream at me. You're supposed to be my manager too, remember?" To my amazement, Irving apologized and seemed calmer for a day or two, but within the week he was back on the phone swearing and cursing and threatening. Don and Glenn were out of town and permanently unavailable. I hadn't had any contact with either of them since New Year's Eve. When I told Irving I wanted to speak to them, he went into the stratosphere. "Don't you dare call those guys," he shrieked. "They'll freak out if you do, and that'll be the end of it." I didn't know which way to turn. I knew Irving was playing everybody off against everybody else, as he always did, and that I was probably being portrayed as the one who was unnecessarily delaying matters for the box set deal, which had to be in the stores by Christmas. I was depicted as the wrench in the works. Whatever reservations Timothy and Joe may have held privately, they signed the agreement without question, leaving me completely isolated. I agonized over what to do and spoke to my lawyers about my legal position, but it was obvious I had no real choice. As one musician who worked with them had once told me prophetically, "We're just pumping gas in Mr. Henley's gas station." It felt to me like we'd all been on the same farm, eating from the same trough, but 2 pigs had gotten so fat they were crowding everybody else out. I didn't want that to happen. The farm was all I knew. Reluctantly and with bile in my throat, I signed their papers. The so-called equal partnership was over. Christmas 2000 was to be my first on my own without my family. I didn't have any lights or ornaments. I had only just moved off the boat and was living in much reduced circumstances. Catherine, ever sensitive to my emotional needs and worried for my health since the band had steamrollered me, came up with an idea. "I know," she said brightly. "Let's buy a small Christmas tree and invite a few close friends and ask each one to bring an ornament for a festive tree trimming party. That way we can start again with our very own decorations." Her suggestion was so genuine and heartfelt, I could have wept. We invited a bunch of people, including Joe Walsh and Timothy Smith, to come over and help us in our small celebration. I didn't invite Glenn, Don, or Irving, none of whom I'd seen since being forced to sign the new agreement, and not just because of the delicate situation, also because, frankly, I was embarrassed about where and how I was living. Irving's main house is a $25 million mansion in Beverly Hills. Glenn has a similar $10 million house nearby, and Don's in Dallas is even more impressive. I was renting a one-bedroom, single-story building off Mulholland Drive, living out of suitcases, my belongings packed in lockers in a downtown storage unit. I'll admit that, with the way I felt that they were bludgeoning me emotionally and financially, I also didn't feel inclined to invite them into my home at that time. Apart from the unexpected delight of having Catherine in my life, I was miserable enough about everything without having to put on a fake smile. In any event, neither Joe nor Tim turned up anyway. Their ornaments arrived courtesy of Federal Express. When Sean, a kid from Irving's office, came around that holiday season with the usual van full of Christmas gifts from the Eagles in Irving's office, the back of his sled on wheels was laden with huge baskets of fruit and flowers, toiletries and candy, ostentatiously wrapped in cellophane and ribbons, being sent out to everyone connected with the band. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Felder," the young assistant told me as I opened the door to my house and prepared to help him carry my gifts inside. "Merry Christmas, Sean," I said, managing a smile. As I stood watching, he reached into the back of the van and pulled out 2 small presents. They were from Timothy and Joe. "Is that it?" I said, staring at him in disbelief. "I'm afraid so, Mr. Felder," Sean said before jumping into the driver's seat and driving off with the rest of his goodies. For the first time in decades, neither Irving nor Don had sent me a thing. I stood there shivering in the driveway as the electric gates slid shut behind him. My attorney, Barry Tyerman, had penciled a date on his calendar to check back with Irving on the process of the box set deal. The date finally arrived in early February, and Barry duly fired off a gentle letter asking for copies of certain agreements with the record label. A response came back that they were not signed. 2 days later, I went out with Catherine for the evening to see a play about the Notre Dame football team at the Amanson Theater, with our friend Gordon Davidson, the theater director. We rode back with Gordon in the car afterward, laughing about how awful the play was. "It was so bad it was funny," I joked. Gordon dropped us home, and we walked into the house arm in arm, still laughing about our evening. It was 11:30 when I clicked on the answering machine. There was just one message. It was from Irving, left 3 hours earlier. "Fingers, call me at home. Here's my number. I gotta talk to you." The very fact that he had called me at all was highly unusual, and there was a tone to his voice I didn't like the sound of. Sitting on the edge of the bed while Catherine made some coffee, I had dialed his number immediately, even though it was late. "Irv, it's Don Felder," I said, wondering what was so urgent that he had given me his home phone number. "Hi, Fingers," he said with a sigh. "I've got some bad news. I'm afraid the guys have had a meeting, and they've decided to go on without you." My entire body ran cold as his words lingered in the air, the resonance hitting me in waves. "What?" I stammered, my mind tripping and tumbling. "It's nothing to do with your playing. It's nothing to do with you. They just think it's in the best interest of the band if they let you go." "Oh my God, Irving," I said, blood rushing to my head. "They can't do this. What do they mean? Why are they doing this? What?" But the words died on my lips. Tears spurted from my eyes, and I started trembling all over. I felt as if I'd been hit by a truck. Irving told me to calm down and try to get some sleep, but of course I couldn't. I sat up most of the night with Catherine, writhing in anxiety. At 7 o'clock in the morning, I called Irving back, hoping to catch him before he went to work, but I couldn't get a hold of him until about 3. Yep, he told me, I've spoken to them, and they're determined to go ahead with this. They're going to send a letter over to your attorney this afternoon confirming that you're fired. I listened in disbelief, still unable to take in what I was hearing. I just don't understand, I said. I thought we were meant to be in this together, forever. I know, Irving sighed, but it just didn't work out that way. Irving, I said breathlessly, I'll do anything. I don't care. Tell them there's been a misunderstanding. I signed their agreements and it's cool. I don't want to be out of the band. Catherine sat with me for the next 2 hours, while I sat by the phone, anxiously waiting for word. Irving eventually rang back. Sorry, Fingers, he said. You're still fired. Give me Don's phone number. I want to speak to Don in person, I told Irving. The numbers I had for him were obsolete. My distress and fear had turned to anger. I'm fed up with speaking through you. I want to speak to the gods. He didn't give me Don's number. In sheer frustration, I dialed all the numbers I had for Don and left messages with his secretary and his business manager, but he never returned my calls. In a last exasperated act, I called Glenn's studio, and to my astonishment, he came to the phone. Overwhelmed at hearing his voice, I begged him not to get rid of me. I'll do anything you say, Roach, I told him, but don't cut me off like this. The Eagles is all I know. I never want to get another letter from Barry Tireman, he said gruffly. Hearing the obvious emotion in his voice, he added witheringly, try to reach some higher ground on this, Felder. The phone line went dead. My legs dropped away from under me, and I slumped to the floor. Catherine held me into a chair and did all she could to calm me down. The combined emotions of the last year and of all the years of angst I'd gone through with the band hit me in the chest like a mallet. I couldn't breathe and I couldn't speak. I felt physically sick. When I had sufficiently composed myself, the first person I called was Joe. What the what's going on, Joe? I asked, still distraught. His attitude was decidedly cool. Well, I don't know, Fingers, he said, lamely from his home in San Diego. As far as I can see, these guys have decided that they're going to do what they're going to do. There ain't much I can do about it. I'd never been more in need of my old buddy Joe, but he wasn't there for me anymore. There was no compassion in his voice. There was no offer to come up and have a beer and we can talk about it. His response was shattering. Joe had always been my friend. We had spent the most time together of all the band members over the year, hanging out in his room, taking drugs, drinking too much, sawing up hotel rooms, playing on his ham radio. I had driven him to rehab, for God's sake. I had taken care of his daughter on the road. Now when push came to shove, he was going with the rest of the band and the money. He wasn't even going to try to fight for me. I felt betrayed. Well, thanks, Joe, I told him angrily. We have not spoken since. The last conversation I had with any of the Eagles was with Tim, whom I had also considered a good friend for many years. To my utter dismay, his response was similar to Joe's. What's going on, Fingers? He said, his tone irritable. When his wife, Jean, handed him the phone, all I know is that they sent me some papers, they look good, and I told my attorney that I'd sign. Why couldn't you just sign the papers like everyone else so we can get on with this? You keep harking back to some deal you made in the 70s, which is history. I don't know why you think you're entitled to more. You don't understand, I told him. I'm not just doing this for me, you know. I'm doing it for you and Joe and Randy and Bernie, too. My God, don't you realize? If Irving was representing us against Don and Glenn, he'd never let us anywhere near these contracts. Timothy sighed. You should have just signed the papers and sent them back, he said before hanging up. My next call was to Susan. After all the years she had endured of me being an Eagle, I felt she had a right to know. She listened in silence as I told her what had happened and then said something unexpected. You know, Don, she told me, this is probably the best thing that could have happened to you. You've been in that unhealthy, abusive environment for far too long. It's affected your health and it's indirectly caused the death of our marriage. I'm glad you're out of that whole nightmare. You're a free man. Use that freedom wisely. My respect and admiration for the mother of my children and the woman I had shared my life with grew enormously. To her eternal credit, her support and sympathy was unequivocal, despite all I had done to break her heart. I was hurting far too much at the time to realize just how true her words were, but I came to understand afterward that she was right. The official termination notice sent to my lawyer stated that the company's board of directors decided that the needs and goals of the company were better served on an ongoing basis without me. They added that it was in the best interest of the company to terminate my employment, but there was something else. They wanted my shares in Eagles Ltd. They even sent my business manager a check to buy them back. They had another thing coming. On my instruction, he sent it right back. Well, that's the end of Chapter 19. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 19 in the comments below. Before I go, I want to give a special shout out to my supporters on Patreon, Matt and Stacy from Canada. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.